You're walking down the street in downtown Denver, rushing to meet your husband for lunch, when you see him through a cafe window holding hands with a beautiful young woman who definitely isn't you. Your heart stops. Your world crumbles. And then, 24 hours later, that same woman calls you on the phone and says the two words that change everything. "Hi, Mom. My name is Isabella Martinez, and I'm 38 years old." Until last Tuesday, I thought I had the perfect marriage. My husband Callum Holden and I have been together for 6 years, married for 4 of those. We met at a construction site where I was doing marketing consultation for a new housing development, and he was the foreman overseeing the project. Callum was this ruggedly handsome guy with calloused hands and the most honest blue eyes I'd ever seen. He had this way of looking at me like I was the only person in the room, even when we were surrounded by dozens of workers. What drew me to Callum wasn't just his looks, it was his integrity. In a world full of men who made promises they couldn't keep, Callum was different. When he said he'd call, he called. When he said he'd be somewhere, he was there early. When he told me he loved me, I felt it in every fiber of my being. Our relationship moved fast because it felt so right. We bought a little craftsman house in the Highlands neighborhood, painted the walls together, planted a garden, and started talking about having kids. But Callum had always been somewhat private about his past. I knew he'd lived in Portland before moving to Denver, and that he'd had a few serious relationships that didn't work out. He mentioned having some family complications that he preferred not to discuss, but I respected his boundaries. Everyone has things they're not ready to share, right? I figured when he was ready to open up about whatever was bothering him, he would. Looking back now, there were little signs I should have picked up on. Random phone calls he'd take outside. Occasional weekend trips to visit old friends that he was always vague about. A certain sadness that would cross his face sometimes when we talked about starting our own family. But I trusted him completely. The idea that Callum might be hiding something significant from me never even crossed my mind. That's what made seeing him with another woman so devastating. Not just the betrayal itself, but the realization that maybe I didn't know my husband as well as I thought I did. Maybe those honest blue eyes had been lying to me for years. Maybe everything I believed about our perfect love story was just an elaborate fiction, and I'd been too naive to see the truth. In that split second outside the cafe window, watching my husband's fingers intertwined with someone else's, I felt my entire world shift beneath my feet. Life in Denver had been everything I dreamed of when Callum and I first moved in together. Our little house on Newton Street was our sanctuary, a 1,920 Craftsman with original hardwood floors, a wraparound porch where we'd drink coffee every morning, and a backyard where Callum had built raised garden beds with his own hands. I worked as a marketing director for a renewable energy company downtown, while Callum ran construction projects all over the city. We had different careers, but we shared the same values: hard work, honesty, and building something meaningful together. Our daily routine was comfortable and predictable in the best way. Callum left for work at 6:30 every morning, always kissing my forehead before he headed out. I'd leave an hour later, and we'd text throughout the day, little messages about our schedules, funny things that happened at work, or just reminders that we loved each other. Lunch together wasn't a regular thing, because our schedules rarely aligned, but when it did happen, it felt special. That Tuesday started like any other day. Callum had been working on a big commercial project near downtown, and I happened to have a client meeting that got canceled at the last minute. On impulse, I decided to surprise him with lunch at his favorite cafe, Rooster and Moon, just a few blocks from his job site. I was actually excited about the spontaneity of it. We'd been so busy lately that we hadn't had much quality time together. The walk from my office to the cafe took about 15 minutes, and I spent the whole time planning what I'd say when I surprised him. Maybe we could extend lunch into a little afternoon date, walk around downtown, maybe even catch an early movie if his schedule allowed. I was feeling romantic and spontaneous, thinking about how lucky I was to have found someone I still wanted to surprise after 6 years together. Callum had always been incredibly affectionate with me. He was the type of man who held my hand while we walked, who pulled me close during movies, who couldn't sit next to me on the couch without reaching over to touch my arm or play with my hair. Physical affection was his love language, and I'd always felt so secure in that constant connection. He made me feel cherished and desired every single day. As I approached Rooster and Moon, I could see through the large front windows that it was busy with the usual lunch crowd: business people, construction workers, college students from the nearby campus. The atmosphere was warm and bustling, exactly the kind of place Callum loved, because it reminded him of the diners he'd grown up eating at in Portland. I was about 50 feet away from the entrance when I spotted Callum's distinctive red flannel shirt and dark hair. He was sitting at a small table near the window, and my first instinct was to smile and wave. But something stopped me mid-step. He wasn't alone. Sitting across from him was a young woman with long auburn hair and delicate features, and they were holding hands across the table. Not just casually touching, but really holding hands, fingers interlaced, both of them leaning forward in an intimate pose that spoke of deep familiarity and affection. The kind of hand-holding that meant something, the kind I thought was reserved for me. I stood frozen on that sidewalk, watching my husband be tender with another woman, and felt my entire reality cracking apart. My first thought was that I must be mistaken. Maybe it was a coworker, maybe she was upset about something and he was comforting her. But as I watched them, I could see this wasn't comfort, this was intimacy. The young woman looked to be in her early 20s, maybe college-aged, with natural auburn curls that caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the cafe window. She was beautiful in an effortless way, wearing a simple sweater and jeans, no makeup that I could see. But what struck me most wasn't her appearance, it was how comfortable she seemed with Callum. How familiar. This clearly wasn't their first meeting. As I watched, Callum reached across the table with his free hand and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear, a gesture so gentle and paternal that it made my chest tight. She smiled at him with such genuine affection that I felt physically sick. Who was this girl? How long had this been going on? How had I missed something this enormous happening in my husband's life? My hands started shaking as I fumbled for my phone, instinctively wanting to take a picture as evidence, but also knowing that capturing this moment would make it undeniably real. Part of me wanted to storm into the cafe and demand an explanation right there in front of everyone. Part of me wanted to run home and pretend I'd never seen anything. Instead, I stood there like a coward, watching my marriage implode through a restaurant window. They talked for another 20 minutes, their conversation animated and comfortable. She laughed at something he said, throwing her head back in a way that reminded me painfully of how I used to laugh with him. When they finally stood to leave, Callum hugged her, not a brief, polite hug, but a long, protective embrace that a man gives to someone he truly cares about. I followed them at a distance as they walked to the parking garage. Callum opened the passenger door of a small blue Honda for her, waited until she was safely inside, then leaned down to say something through the window before she drove away. The care in his gestures was unmistakable. This wasn't an affair, this was something deeper, more complicated. When Callum got home that evening, I was waiting in our kitchen, my heart pounding so hard I could barely speak. "How was your day?" I asked, giving him the chance to tell me about lunch, to explain what I'd seen. "Oh, you know, same old stuff. Busy day on the site. We're behind schedule again." He kissed my cheek and went to wash his hands, acting completely normal. "Did you grab lunch anywhere interesting?" "Just a sandwich at the usual place. Nothing special." The lie hit me like a physical blow. Not only had Bob sandwich at the usual place, he'd been with another woman, but he was actively deceiving me about it. That night, as Callum slept peacefully beside me, I stared at the ceiling and felt like I was living with a stranger. The man I'd trusted with my heart, my future, my dreams of a family, had been living a double life, and I had no idea how deep his deception went or how long it had been going on. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate at work. For 3 days I walked around like a zombie, watching Callum act completely normal while my world fell apart. Every kiss felt like a betrayal. Every "I love you" felt like a lie. I kept waiting for him to confess, to explain, to give me some reason to believe that what I'd seen wasn't what I thought it was. On Friday morning, I made a decision that went against every instinct I had about trust and privacy in marriage. I called in sick to work and hired a private investigator named Rick Chen, whose office was downtown near the courthouse. Rick was a former police detective, probably in his 50s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a no-nonsense approach that I found reassuring. "Mrs. Martinez," he said as I sat in his small, cluttered office, "I have to ask, are you prepared for what we might find? Sometimes the truth is more complicated than we expect." I thought about Callum's gentle hands, his honest face, the way he'd held me every night for 6 years. "I need to know," I told Rick. "Whatever it is, I can't live with not knowing." Rick's investigation started immediately. He followed Callum for a week, documenting his movements, taking photographs, gathering information. What he found was both better and worse than an affair. Callum met with the young woman, whose name was Elizabeth Monroe, 3 times that week. Always at the same cafe, always at the same time, always with the same intimate familiarity I'd witnessed. But Rick discovered something else. Elizabeth wasn't just any young woman. She was a freshman at the University of Colorado, Denver, studying nursing. She lived in a small apartment near campus with a roommate. And according to Rick's research, she'd been born in Portland, Oregon, 19 years ago, exactly 9 years before I met Callum. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to form a picture I wasn't prepared for. When Rick handed me the folder containing photos and background information, my hands shook as I opened it. There, staring back at me from Elizabeth's university ID photo, were Callum's blue eyes and the same stubborn cowlick he always complained about. "Mrs. Martinez," Rick said gently, "I think your husband has been meeting with his daughter." The word hung in the air between us like a bomb waiting to explode. Daughter. Callum had a daughter. A 19-year-old daughter he'd never told me about. A daughter he'd been secretly meeting with for who knows how long. A daughter whose existence changed everything I thought I knew about the man I married. "But why?" "Wouldn't he tell me?" I whispered. "Why keep her a secret?" Rick shrugged. "That's a conversation you'll need to have with him." But from what I observed, they have a close relationship. She clearly adores him, and he's very protective of her. Whatever his reasons for keeping this private, it doesn't appear to be because he doesn't care about her. That night, I sat at our kitchen table with Rick's folder spread out in front of me, staring at pictures of my husband with his daughter, the daughter I never knew existed. In every photo, they looked happy together, comfortable, like they'd been building a relationship for years. And I'd been completely excluded from it. I felt betrayed, confused, angry, and strangely relieved all at once. At least it wasn't an affair. But somehow, this felt even more complicated. The confrontation I'd been dreading and preparing for never came. Instead, on Sunday morning while Callum was outside working in the garden, my phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something compelled me to answer. "Hello?" I said cautiously. "Hi, is this Isabella Martinez?" The voice was young, female, nervous. "Yes, this is Isabella." There was a pause then. "My name is Elizabeth Monroe. I think you're married to my dad." My heart stopped. The folder with Rick's investigation was still sitting on the kitchen counter, and Elizabeth's university photo seemed to stare at me accusingly. "Elizabeth," I said carefully, "how did you get this number?" "I've had it for a long time," she said, her voice shaking. "Dad gave it to me when I first moved to Denver. He said if anything ever happened to him, or if I ever needed help and couldn't reach him, I should call you. He said you were the most important person in his life, and that you'd take care of me." I sank into a chair, overwhelmed by the implications of what she was saying. "Elizabeth, I don't understand. Callum never told me about you." She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, I could hear tears in her voice. "He wanted to. He's wanted to tell you about me for years. But he was scared you'd leave him." "Why would I leave him for having a daughter?" "Because of how I happened. Elizabeth said softly. My mom. She wasn't a good person. She was into drugs, bad relationships, dangerous stuff. Dad was young and stupid, and he got caught up in her world for a while. When she got pregnant with me, she disappeared. He didn't even know I existed until I was 15 and she overdosed. My chest tightened as the pieces fell into place. So you've only known each other for 4 years? Yeah. Mom left a letter before she died, telling me who my father was and how to find him. When I showed up at his construction site in Portland 4 years ago, he was so shocked he almost fell off a ladder. She laughed through her tears. But he stepped up immediately. He got custody of me, put me through high school, helped me apply for colleges. He moved to Denver because I got a scholarship here. The revelation hit me like lightning. He moved to Denver for you, not for the job opportunities. He's never told you any of this? No, I whispered. Nothing. He loves you so much, Isabella. He talks about you constantly. He shows me pictures, tells me stories about your life together. He calls you his miracle, his second chance at happiness. But he was terrified that if you knew about me, about his past with my mom, you'd think he was damaged goods. I was crying now, overwhelmed by the magnitude of Callum's sacrifice and secrecy. Elizabeth, why are you calling me now? Because yesterday he told me he was going to tell you everything. He said he couldn't keep living with this secret between you two, that it wasn't fair to either of us. He was planning to sit you down this weekend and explain everything. But I wanted to call you first, because... Her voice broke. Because I was hoping you might want to meet me. I've wanted to know you for so long. You're the woman who made my dad smile again. Through the kitchen window, I could see Callum kneeling in our garden, carefully tending the tomato plants we'd planted together. The man who'd been carrying the weight of this secret for 4 years, protecting both his daughter and his wife from what he thought would be an impossible situation. Elizabeth, I said, wiping my eyes, would you like to come for dinner tonight? I think it's time we all sat down and talked as a family. The word slipped out before I could stop it, but it felt right. Family. That evening, watching Callum's face when Elizabeth walked through our front door was something I'll never forget. The shock, the terror, the desperate hope in his eyes as he looked between his daughter and his wife, trying to understand how his two worlds had suddenly collided. Isabella, I can explain, he started, but I held up my hand to stop him. Callum, sit down, we all need to talk. The conversation that followed was the most honest, painful, and ultimately healing discussion of my life. Callum told me everything about his wild years in Portland, about Elizabeth's mother Sarah and her addiction, about the day a scared 15-year-old girl showed up claiming to be his daughter. He explained how he'd gotten a paternity test immediately, how he'd fought for custody, how he'd struggled to become the father Elizabeth needed while dealing with his own guilt and shame about his past. I wanted to tell you, he said, holding my hands across our kitchen table while Elizabeth sat quietly beside us. Every single day for 4 years, I wanted to tell you, but I was so afraid you'd think I was this terrible person who'd abandoned his child, or that you wouldn't want to deal with my complicated past. But you didn't abandon her, I said. You didn't even know she existed. I know that now, but 4 years ago I felt like such a failure. Here I was, this guy who thought he had his life together, and suddenly I had a teenage daughter who'd been living in foster care because her mother was dead and I was nowhere to be found. Elizabeth spoke up for the first time since arriving. Dad, you saved my life. Before I found you, I was headed down the same path as Mom. You gave me stability, education, hope. You gave me a future. Looking at the two of them together, Callum's protective posture, Elizabeth's obvious adoration for her father, I realized that everything I'd thought was betrayal was actually love. Callum had been protecting both of us in the only way he knew how, carrying the burden of secrecy to shield us from complications he was sure we couldn't handle. The integration of Elizabeth into our lives wasn't immediate or simple, but it was natural. She started joining us for Sunday dinners, then weekend activities, then holidays. I watched Callum blossom, as he was finally able to be openly proud of his daughter. And I watched Elizabeth flourish as she gained not just a father, but a family. 6 months later, when Elizabeth called me Mom for the first time, it wasn't planned or forced, it just slipped out during a conversation about her nursing school classes. The word hung in the air for a moment before she blushed and started to apologize. "Don't apologize," I told her. "I've been hoping you'd feel comfortable enough to say that." Callum had been right to be afraid this situation was complicated, messy, and challenged everything I thought I knew about our relationship. But he'd been wrong about my capacity to love his daughter and understand his past. The secret that he thought would destroy us actually brought us closer together. Today, as I watch my husband teaching Elizabeth how to change the oil in her car, I'm grateful for that terrifying moment outside the cafe window. Sometimes the things that look like betrayal are actually love in disguise. Sometimes the secrets people keep aren't about deception, they're about protection. And sometimes a family isn't what you planned, but exactly what you needed. Elizabeth graduates from nursing school next month, and Callum and I will be in the front row cheering for our daughter. Because that's what she is now, not his secret, but our blessing.